I found the second phone 3 days before my wife asked for a divorce. It wasn't hidden well enough to fool me, just well enough to insult me. A burner phone in the back drawer of the guest bathroom. No case, no personal photos, no notifications except encrypted messages, and one pinned audio note labeled, "If he signs, move fast." That was the moment I stopped asking whether Vanessa was unhappy. Unhappy people leave. Strategic people prepare. And by the time my wife sat across from me with soft eyes and rehearsed disappointment, I already knew she wasn't leaving my life. She was trying to leave with the parts of it she thought she could carry. Before I tell you how I let my wife believe she was one signature away from taking my company, my home, and the last clean version of my name, stay with me, because this story is not really about divorce. It's about the moment you realize the person closest to you is no longer loving you. They're managing you. My name is Silas Marlowe. I built Northspire Dynamics from a rented office, 2 government contracts, and the kind of obsession that makes people call you disciplined when what they really mean is difficult to reach. By 41, I had the apartment downtown, the interviews I hated, the company valuation everyone else loved, and a marriage that looked elegant from the outside because both people in it had become very good at not embarrassing each other in public. Vanessa was beautiful in the kind of way that made rooms cooperate with her. She never had to raise her voice to become the center of attention. She understood timing, texture, silence. She knew which dress made older investors underestimate her and which smile made them feel flattered for doing it. When I met her, I thought she saw through the noise around me. Later, I realized she was studying it. That's the problem with intelligent men who live too long inside high-functioning loneliness. The first woman who makes peace feel effortless can start to feel like home, even when she's only learning the floor plan. Our marriage didn't collapse all at once. People always imagine betrayal as a dramatic event because that version is easier to survive. The truth is uglier. Sometimes betrayal arrives as a series of tiny edits, a question that goes slightly too deep, a password she has no reason to need, a dinner with her mother that somehow turns into a conversation about asset structure, a joke about how I'd be impossible in court because I was too private to look innocent. Little things, small enough to dismiss if you still want love more than clarity. At first, I did. I told myself Vanessa was just anxious, that Lorraine Quinn had always been invasive, that Paige, Vanessa's younger sister, was just spoiled enough to mistake arrogance for intelligence. I explained everything. That is what decent people do when they don't want to believe they are being slowly converted into someone else's opportunity. Then I found the phone. Not in our bedroom, not in her office, not anywhere dramatic enough to feel cinematic. In the guest bathroom. Like she needed a second life, but wanted it close. I didn't confront her. I charged it. Then I waited. That night, while Vanessa slept beside me with one hand resting lightly near my shoulder, the gesture of a woman who still wanted to look loving even in the dark, I opened the phone and read enough to change the shape of my life forever. There were messages with Lorraine, messages with Paige, a private thread with a lawyer I didn't know, draft timelines, language rehearsal, asset estimates, emotional framing, not just how to leave me, how to present me. That was the part that hollowed me out. They weren't planning a painful separation. They were building a narrative, secretive, emotionally withholding, potentially unstable under pressure, financially opaque, difficult to trust. There was even a note from Lorraine that read, "Men like Silas don't lose in business. You have to make him lose in character first." I read that line 3 times, not because it surprised me, because I suddenly understood what kind of marriage I had really been in. Vanessa was not collecting courage. She was collecting leverage. And once you understand that, everything changes. The late-night questions, the oddly timed sympathy, the moments she asked whether I was still feeling pressure before major board reviews, the casual curiosity about my trust structure, the way Paige joked that if I ever disappeared into my work completely, at least Vanessa would get something nice out of it. I had laughed then. That is another thing betrayal teaches you. Some of the warnings in your life don't arrive as red flags. They arrive as jokes people only make because they think your instincts have already been softened enough not to hear them. The next morning, Vanessa kissed me on the cheek and asked if I'd be home early. I looked at her and saw, for the first time, the split between appearance and intent. She looked the same. That was the worst part. Beautiful, composed, concerned. The face of a woman anyone would believe. "I'll be late," I said. She nodded, then asked carefully, "Do you think the board is going to push harder this quarter?" There it was again. Not the question, the target hidden inside it. I smiled and said, "Depends who they think is vulnerable." Something flickered across her face, gone in a second. That was when I knew she was not as calm as she wanted me to think. So I started preparing. Not for revenge, that word is too childish for what came next. I prepared for separation from illusion. I moved my real governance documents into an offline trust archive with independent legal verification. I restructured temporary signing authority. I flagged unusual access attempts. I had outside counsel review dormant spousal exposure risks. And then, because some people only reveal themselves fully when they think they are close to winning, I left enough doors half open for Vanessa to believe she was finally seeing what I had always protected. A draft that looked incomplete, a file path that seemed carelessly labeled, a printed packet in my study with the sort of numbers greedy people mistake for destiny. I wanted to know how far she would go once she believed the finish line was visible. The answer came quickly. 2 nights later, Lorraine and Paige came over for dinner. I stayed quiet, listened more than I spoke, watched the 3 of them move around my home as if they were already rearranging it in their heads. Lorraine complimented the art in the tone of a woman pricing estate pieces before probate. Paige wandered onto the terrace and laughed into her wine glass, saying the place always felt less like a home than a museum built by a man trying to outrun feelings. Vanessa didn't defend me. She never defended me when the room tilted in their direction. That was its own answer. After dinner, I excused myself and went upstairs. I didn't sleep. I stood in the dark hallway above the living room while their voices rose through the open space below. Paige spoke first. "So when do you do it?" Vanessa answered quietly. "Soon. He's distracted." If the filing hits after the board tension starts, he'll focus on containment. Lorraine made a pleased sound. "Good. Don't make the mistake women always make with men like him." "What mistake?" Paige asked. "Believing silence means depth," Lorraine said. "Sometimes silence is just where they hide their weaknesses." I almost laughed, not because she was right, because she was so certain she understood a man she had only ever measured from the outside. Then Vanessa said something I still remember more clearly than I want to. "He doesn't think people can study him because he thinks being reserved makes him unreadable." There was a pause. Then, softer, "That's why this works." That sentence ended my marriage long before the paperwork arrived. Not because it was cruel, because it was clinical. She didn't sound angry. She didn't sound wounded. She sounded efficient. And there is something profoundly lonely about hearing the person who once held your face in both hands speak about you like a structure she has almost finished disassembling. The next day, I called my attorney. The day after that, I called an independent board director I trusted enough to tell the truth without decoration. And then I did the hardest thing a person can do once betrayal becomes undeniable. I stopped trying to save the version of the relationship that only existed in my hope. That is a private kind of grief no one really talks about. Not losing the person, losing the story you kept telling yourself about why they stayed. Vanessa made her move on Friday. She asked if we could have dinner at home. No phones, no interruptions, just honesty. People always say honesty, like they invented it 5 minutes before needing cover. I agreed. She wore black silk and an expression she had probably practiced in the mirror, regret touched lightly by exhaustion, as if she had carried this marriage alone and was almost too gentle to say so. "Silas," she said after the first glass of wine, "I don't think this marriage is healthy anymore." I let the silence sit between us. Then I asked, "For whom?" She blinked. That was not the answer she prepared for. "For either of us," she said. "You're disappearing into work. You shut me out. You keep parts of your life locked away and then act surprised when I feel unsafe." Unsafe. There it was, the word designed for sympathy. The word built to move first in any public retelling. I nodded once. "And what would make you feel safe?" She hesitated only a second. "Transparency. Fairness. A clean agreement before this becomes ugly." Translation: sign before you know enough to resist. I looked at the papers she slid across the table. Clean, polished, reasonable on the surface, structured to look balanced, actually designed to trigger a chain of vulnerability once executed. She had done her homework. That almost impressed me. Instead, I asked, "Did Lorraine help draft the emotional language, or was that Paige?" Her face changed, only for a second, but it changed. That was the moment she knew the room had shifted. "I don't know what you mean," she said. "Of course you do." I stood, walked to the media wall, and tapped the control panel. The first screen lit up, then the second, then all of them. Messages, audio, metadata trails, access logs, draft narratives, the burner phone archive, the conversation from downstairs 2 nights earlier. Paige laughing, Lorraine strategizing, Vanessa saying in her own voice, "That's why this works." Vanessa went completely still. It's strange, the silence that follows exposure. Not dramatic, not explosive, just the sudden collapse of performance when there is no audience left to manipulate. "You went through my phone," she whispered. I looked at her for a long moment. "No," I said. "I walked into my own life and finally turned the lights on." She stood slowly. "You were baiting me." "No," I said again, calmer this time. "I was giving you time to stop." That landed harder than anger would have, because it was true. There had been moments, more than she deserved, when I would have accepted honesty over humiliation, truth over theater, grief over strategy. She had chosen none of them. She chose management, narrative, leverage. And now she was standing in the middle of the evidence she helped create, still trying to decide whether denial or outrage would save more of her. It saved nothing. My attorney entered first, then the private process server, then the director from the board committee who had agreed to witness the meeting because public men do not get destroyed only in private anymore. The infrastructure of a lie has to be interrupted in real time. Vanessa stared at all of us as if decency had betrayed her. Maybe that's what happens when people get too used to being the smartest cruelty in the room. They begin to mistake accountability for injustice. Lorraine called 3 times, then 6, then 10. I declined every call. Paige sent a message that read, "You're overreacting." That one almost made me smile. People who build traps for a living always sound shocked when consequences arrive with names and signatures. The legal process moved quickly after that. Not because I wanted blood, because I wanted distance. There's a difference. I protected the company, secured the board, closed the openings she thought were permanent, made sure every version of my name she hoped to sell came attached to the truth that produced it. Vanessa lost her leverage before she ever held it long enough to enjoy it. Lorraine lost access to the future she had already spent in her mind. Paige learned, too late, that mocking restraint is easy until restraint stops being passive and becomes precise. And me? I went back to work, but not unchanged. That would be a lie. What I lost was not just a marriage. It was the last part of me that still confused being carefully observed with being deeply loved. That is a brutal lesson, but maybe also a necessary one. Because attention is not devotion. Access is not intimacy. And just because someone knows where your fractures are does not mean they ever intended to protect them. For a while, I was ashamed of how long it took me to see it. Then I understood something I wish more people learned sooner. There is no shame in being sincere. The shame belongs to the person who studies sincerity like a weakness. If there is any meaning in what happened, maybe it's this. You do not have to become colder to love yourself better. You do not have to become cruel to become harder to misuse. And healing does not always begin when you get revenge. Sometimes it begins when you stop begging your own intuition to be quieter just so someone else can stay comfortable. Sometimes self-respect is nothing more glamorous than this: closing the door, telling the truth, and refusing to call your own disappearance love. If this story stayed with you, leave a like, subscribe, and tell me in the comments, what hurts more in the end? Being betrayed, or realizing how often you explained away what your heart already knew? Some people don't enter your life to love you. They enter to learn what you'll keep giving even after it starts hurting you. Don't let that lesson make you hard. Let it make you honest. I'll see you in the next story.